everyone. I hope you can hear me well. So today I'm going to talk about the developers manifesto, what Web3 can learn from open source. So first thing, as got introduced, I'm Eomji. Many people think it's emoji, but it's O front of the M. I'm a head of research and operations at Incode Cloud, which is the education community. Mainly we focus on onboarding developers and helping early stage founders across the whole ecosystem. And I'm based in Munich, guest scientist at TU Munich. So if you're around, please let me know so that we can grab a beer. First, so two sides of the same coin. So the previous talk, it was really interesting that everyone also started to say that let's not reinventing the old wheels we have been experimenting in human history and IT development. So we already built the foundation of the internet without financial incentives, not saying that that was the best way, but open source was working. So now we introduce the system with incentives, yet struggles to attract and retain developers within Web3. So despite having something novel like tokens, financial incentives, and DAOs, Web3 still struggles to engage and retain developers. So we're going to look into the lens more focusing on developer side, not the protocol business side, so that how, what kind of challenges open source had and how they recover that and what we can learn from that. So just in a nutshell, first my question, how many of you are developer or have been developing something previously? So some of you a little bit perhaps feel same pain points now. So we still have poor tooling and fragmented ecosystems, which have been nourishing a lot of innovation across the ecosystem instead of having one. Yesterday we also had several chats. I see that talking about fragmentation, innovation, and standardization. So now we are coming to the stage that if you want to have a broader adoption, what we can do with this fragmented ecosystem and how can we help developers. So the barrier is still too high. So do you imagine AWS or Google Cloud go to the hackathon and explaining cloud architecture? Nobody gonna do that. They said they're built on AWS. But now when we go to hackathon in Web2 world, explaining about blockchain, any protocol, we normally need to start. What is the value proposition of the blockchain, decentralized system? This is gonna change in some years, but yet entry is quite high because we need to explain people why we need to use this system. Yet once when they start to, they need to understand a little bit different tech, deeper technology to start to use it even. And lacking documentation because we are actually developing things very, very fast. Sometimes it got obsolete very, very fast. Then when it comes to the developer who are scarce time to get onboarded, they start to feel that, okay, is it really worth my time? They will be thinking. And another thing is so that we were trying to incentivizing people who are engaging with us, but too many incentives are sometimes financial, not functional, so that it can flash back to us that it doesn't work in a long term. So why did open source succeed in creating developer ecosystem while Web3 are struggling? And then we can think about different case study. Guess what open source project I'm talking about? Merging this code is a nightmare. So what happened? Git. I guess every one of you are benefiting from Git a lot. Can you imagine the word before Git? Maybe some of you actually experienced it. Many of us, perhaps at school, university, we already started to use this version control system. Before Git, developers were struggling with a slow centralized version control. So whole Linux was using this central version control system. Large team was having very a slow collaboration, a lot of emerging conflicts, and they were losing some changes. And then there was some irony that you are building a open source system, but relying on centralized version control. We needed a better way. But people were a little bit struggling, still keep using it, but something big happened. 2005, Linux lost access to Bitkeeper, which was a centralized version control system. They were providing service no more. And you had to think about, how can we collaborate? The founder or who built the Linux were thinking, okay, maybe instead of going to other system, let's build something. And then in a few weeks, they built a Git, a fast distributed system designed for open source collaboration. And they open it up. I cannot maintain by myself, let's build it together. Instead of relying on central server, every developer had a full copy of repository, branching, merging, rollback. So I don't need to explain too much detail in Git, but what happened is it completely changed the way to work with software development. It was great, but not perfect because it has steep learning curve, very similar to Web3 now. Commands like rebase, merge, now we know what it means. But still, it was very like new to many developers, and you had to convince them to use the system and understanding what's happening. Also, mistakes like force push could cause serious issues, so you need to educate developers. I don't know it happened to you, but like during my university time, at least one project every semester, one of your team member push and completely erase the whole repository. It was the great part of the education, but that happened to professional developers as well. And of course, huge enterprise, they see that this like opportunity cost of like training the developers, so there was some registering to this like move. And then like when we think about that, like handling this in massive scale, of course, it's gonna need a lot of different tools. So how it become? First, it was inevitable because it was solving huge real developer problem. So eventually, people know that it was better off. Like developers without Git, can you imagine? Like just it doesn't work. And then it was designed for open source collaboration for open source projects, so it just made sense. And then people are agreeing to that ethos. And more importantly, strong ecosystem industry adoption. So GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, this kind of projects were building their own toolkit to help developers who doesn't understand Git so well, or like even some newbies. Still, we are struggling to making version control system understood by non-tech users, but still it made a huge progress. Now, a lot of students can learn about Git very, very easily. And then we agreed on some best practices and learning. So that even though it's open source, instead of everyone is like following their own rule, at a certain point, industry started to have kind of common rule and promises that what kind of commit message or like a push we're gonna do, some practices like what is the good thing to do, bad thing to do, and going through those like cycles, we agreed on like how to work with the Git, and that become pretty much a rule without any enforcement. So what we can learn is like developers can adopt something if there makes life easier. Like, no wonder why. Everyone does that, not only developers. Standardization drives adoption. It was good in the beginning, anybody trying a little bit different things, but when we are working on mass adoption, coordination, standardization, it may make us a little bit slow or a little bit centralized at a certain point, but if we can balance that well, this is the only way we can actually push the adoption. So that decentralization just wasn't enough if it was creating a lot of pain point to people. And of course, community-led like innovation worked out, and that's something we can keep remind ourselves. Sometimes we feel like it's failing, but it's not. It worked out previously, and we can make it. Next one. It works on my machine. Guess what it is? So Docker. So back then, developers saying like, oh, can you test that? Oh, it's not working anymore. Like, it works on my machine. That was a huge pain point for developers struggle with inconsistent environment, code behave differently in development, testing, production. Like, you had to spend a lot of time for like a nonsense problem to solve, which was not critical for your product. Deploying application required complex configuration. You were spending on configuration rather than actually developing. And then you even were not sure if you're going to be working on your client or like user end. So give me one package that runs everywhere. Like everyone was like thinking, what could be a solution? In 2013, Solomon built a Docker to standardize application environment. Container was allowing application to run identically across the development, testing, and production. Many of you must have experience using that. And also, unlike virtual machine, it was much more lightweight, so everyone can use easily. But like they also had a similar struggles. You can see the certain patterns. Early adoption, like enterprise, were slow to replace the traditional deployment method. Again, they see the huge opportunity cost. You have a large group. You need to change their mindset. You need to change the workflow. And also, you're going to have some like failing against people who got already used to old system. Standardization and compatibility issue. So competing like container technologies, cost of fragmentation. This is something we do a lot at the moment as well in like a multiple L1s and different L2s. You will see that even though they're called compatible, some core things are fundamentally different that developers cannot bring their skill one to another. So they had a similar issue as well. And then that brings, of course, like a coordination issues that eventually someone had to like migrate to more like a adopted workflow. And of course, security isolation concerns, and most importantly, like they also had a problem with the business model and monetization. Like they were struggling to balance open source adoption with the financial sustainability. There's a lot of open source projects, even though they're used by million people, that if someone pays just $1 a year, they should earn million, but because it's not, they actually struggle financially a lot. There's several projects, you may perhaps name that, why they are struggling to provide their services. What Docker tried, first, like again, they solved the problem people had to use, so we need to really think about what value we are providing. Deployments become much, much simple, but also they were improving their developer experience a lot to make a superior option to use this one. So they're like, they provide easy to use CLI, or like great documentation, which is really important. And then that was building huge ecosystem that people can learn and use it seamless. Those like industry adoption was like very similar to Git, right? Like you start to have a different ecosystem player who are building, or like you can integrate with the multiple different things. It integrated with the Kubernetes, that like it become very like seamless pipeline to use. And then like a important thing is another like open standard. So they were like working on this initiative so that it become interoperable everywhere. So what we can learn, very similar, that developer adopt what makes their life easier, standardization works, but also ecosystem integration is accelerating their growth, and monetization is important. Even though people come here for value and philosophy, if you don't make this business sustainable, we cannot continue building this project. So we need a little bit thinking about how to monetize them. One last example, so managing thousands of containers is chaotic. You already had a little bit hint in previous slide. It was Kubernetes. So Docker made deployment much easier. Now you don't need to worry about different environment. It's just going to work. But managing hundreds or thousands of containers were chaotic. So team had to manually deploy, scale, multiple across the things, and it just doesn't work. So no standardized way to orchestrate container in large scale is pain. So how about let's automating it? Interestingly, Google, like huge conglomerates, right? So Google had already solved this problem internally with the Borg. That was already managing millions of containers. In 2014, they decided to open source this one, the successor of the Borg, as a Kubernetes, giving the world standardized way to manage container. Why they were doing it? Like let's think about it. Like Google had all the way and all the reason to make it as a paid solution that people can use. Google had, of course, another plan. Why not make this as a whole industry standard? So Google open sourced it to drive industry-wide adoption and make it as a standard. So also that way, they knew that like it's gonna be only like ensure its longevity, so it's gonna survive long term. While they have other product focus, so for them, it just like makes sense to do that. Perhaps you can see that with all the AI, like maybe some company going more like open source, some company not. It's not they're completely giving up their moats. They had a different reason and different way to keep the longevity here, bring the innovation while they can benefit from it in different way. Also, this is a very nice way to give back. It was still like not that easy. That Kubernetes is still complex architecture with many components you need to understand. And again, enterprise were like resisting a lot in the beginning. And you need to handle like a multi-cloud was still very complex. But again, one thing I wanted to bring up as a point is like the good governance of the cloud native computing foundation was bringing the control between corporate sponsors, open source contributors. And guess what? Who did it? Like Linux guys did that. So what Kubernetes did well, they were not reinventing the wheel, they were building on top of proven technology Borg. Sometimes we think about how about building consensus from the scratch. We have already a lot of L1, L2 solutions. Maybe sometimes we don't need to build things from scratch. And also we don't need to build exactly same project one more time. Why not? Like working on that and then contributing and building better one together. And also like we need to make other players involved and using together. Making a community is not about just having ethos and we like blindly like aping on coin. It's rather like we agree and working on together towards the same value. So that makes sense to have some adoption by utilizing different Web3 tech stack. And most importantly, strong governance model. We already have a DAO structure and everything, but we need to make sure that this is helping us to make a long-term sustainable goal and executing the strategy in efficient enough, yet decentralized. So this is like 3 things, like a standardization-driven adoption, which all 3 of them, in the end, they all go towards the standardization, and then neutral governance ensure longevity. And you can see that it was the Google project, but how governance worked, in the end, it was like open source community, Linux jumped in, and ecosystem-wide collaboration wins because now everyone sees the reason to use. What do we have that Web2 does not have? We have token. Token, sometimes we often like very hesitating to talk about this, especially when we are very developer science driven. But token itself is actually product. We need to really understand this and we need to utilize it. First, of course, it has a utility, pay for network services, unless it's meme coin. It's an equity. All the participants are having this like token to join your governance. And also it's a treasury. Like this is really important aspect sometimes we don't talk about. That's the budget, how foundation operate and like support you. So like there is a reason I understand a lot of projects try to defend the price and many people, community are focusing on that because it's also treasury to fund operations. So early adoption of the protocol often rely on token holders for activity and driving the token value because you want to capture all this value. But if you don't support developers, you are losing your initial utility and function as equity, treasury, or go like sideways. We now have already token, which is helping incentivizing via ownership. So like an open source community was struggling how to pay them out. So when you look into the history of each project, often they rely on like a corporates like paying for them, or people are paying to like a patron system, you know. So open source contributors were like working often just based on passion and they were not getting paid. In blockchain, we have a different way to recognize and track their contributions and pay through token. And contribution is like also not only like we're gonna go a bit later, but also not only they're just contributing, they have a say how it's gonna work. So you can actually incentivize people who are building system, participating to the governance, and decide how the project should go, instead of like there are gonna be different people who are building and different people who has a say. And then you can see that like many open source projects still struggles that they were dependent on a few key maintainer and corporate backers, but in blockchain it's much easier to fork. Not necessarily we are encouraging forking like every second time when we have a different opinion, but also some projects were abandoned when corporate sponsor pulled out, but we have like a token. So like we have a less dependent on one backer paying you, but we have a token which has intrinsic value to support the treasury. And now a community-driven governance model is helping us to have decision-making power. It's distributed, but also helping builders to have a say. And then you can see, even based on contribution, perhaps you can argue that who should have strong voice. An innovative funding mechanism, we can a little bit play around. So like many open source projects struggle to secure funding. But like you can see that like let's say like critical project like OpenSSL like have maintainers working for free despite it's used by millions, and you can only imagine that they can do that if they super love and they actually earn money from elsewhere, but otherwise we cannot expect that happen. But now we have an interesting funding mechanism. Like everyone is experimenting around which token and blockchain allowed, which is quadratic funding, and also DAO. We can utilize DAO in different way. Just like there's a little bit problem. I'm very mindful of time, so I will be a little bit faster. But like this one, you know, we have a token. We can do what we are doing bad. First, we are over relying on tokenomics for engagement, so that speculative participation happen, but no long-term developer commitment. And we are surprised. Come on, I gave $1 million grant, but why nobody is building? Because we didn't build a good economies around, so that they are not incentivized to stay long-term. And we overcomplicating governance structures, so they're like you sometimes don't want to vote for every single thing. And this even actually becomes centralized decision-making at certain points, and people start to be very tired of it. And again, still very poor developer experience and tooling. I know in the audience, some of you are working on developer experience. This is really important thing, because if developer struggles with the poor documentation, how much expensive token you have, how much token you give, they will eventually leave because it just doesn't make sense for them in their opportunity cost in long term. We need to make it easier, not harder. Blockchain is really complicated, like technical products. Our users are developers, and those developers are technical enough to understand your product, but still they don't want to like sabotage their life. That can happen only in very, very early stage when they're very curious about the tech. So your early stage, like advocates, you realize that your documentation sucks, but they stay. But remember, when you go to mass adoption, very different characters coming in. So other developers who are still curious, but they are very conscious about time, they're not necessarily most aligned with your design principle. For them, if you don't make their life easier, they will leave. So last thing I wanted to say is that we need to focus on enabling than incentivizing. It may sound sometimes same, it's not necessarily. So when you see that developers coming to your ecosystem, you need to help them to succeed. You need to help them to make revenue. Either they make a business, if they're a developer, if they don't want to make business, they should earn successfully and recognize their contribution. So we need to enable them. But if you just think that if I pour the money, they will stay, easy money, easy go. So that's the thing I wanted to say. And everyone, I hope that we can build this ecosystem together. And if you have any questions, perhaps I will take it later. I will be staying till tomorrow morning-ish. So feel free to reach out. I'm Eomji Park. You can find me easily on Telegram and Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you.